Lately, the internet has become obsessed with the idea of liminality. Liminal photography is all the rage in certain corners. YouTube channels like Nobody produce music playlists which express a uniquely liminal feel. The Backrooms horror series has merged this notion of liminal spaces with SCP-adjacent indie horror. And of course, there is the infamous album Everywhere at the End of Time by The Caretaker, which to me seems like a particularly unique take on the concept of liminal music. The term liminality originated within the field of anthropology, in which the term was mostly used to describe certain kinds of initiation rituals, which were intended to transform an individual by bringing them into extreme circumstances or extreme states of consciousness. The liminal state was understood to be a condition which bridged a distinct before and after. Before the ritual, a person was unclean. After, they were purified. Before the individual is a boy, after he is a man. The liminal realm is a condition of ongoing transformation. It is neither here nor there. It is, in a sense, nowhere, as it is a state which exceeds the categorical structures of a given form of human consciousness. Within contemporary liminal media, we are presented with images, sounds, or scenarios which are intended to invoke the feeling of liminality. A liminal space is always a mixture of the inexpressibly alien and hauntingly familiar. Within The Caretaker's Everywhere at the End of Time, for example, we are given a mesmerizingly glacial and persistent cascade of music which feels like a memory which we can barely recall. We experience a sonic simulation of the process by which the mind comes to fragment and disintegrate within the final years of life, the nowhere which exists between life and death. Liminality always seems to express a certain amnesic quality. A liminal space is one which you know you have been in before, yet which you cannot, no matter how hard you might try, ever fully recollect. Confronted with the possibility that our memories are always fragmented and incomplete, an unspoken question begins to bubble up quietly from the unconscious. What if there is so much more that I do not remember? What if my entire sense of self is hopelessly incomplete? Am I really so certain that I actually am who I believe that I am? And if not, then what might the truth actually be? Although it might seem tempting to dismiss the current ubiquity of liminality as yet another random internet fad, I think this would miss something very profound which this bizarre trend is gesturing towards. Whenever our collective attention seems to be inexplicably drawn towards something so seemingly unremarkable yet so oddly specific, we should take this as a sign that something deeper is at play. Something within the collective unconscious. I've noticed another interesting trend within the incessant dialogue of YouTube socio-political commentary lately, one which has only grown more and more ubiquitous over the course of the past couple of years to the point that it is basically now a meme. That is the dry, quirky half-joke of referring to the current year as current year. Again, this might not seem to be very remarkable at first brush, but I think there is more going on here, and I think it is very closely related to the trend of liminal art and music. Referring to the present year within a YouTube video as current year always seems to be stated with a kind of cynical flippantness. Like, it seems that actually stating the current year will give the video an unnecessarily dated feel. After all, there very well could be many people who watch this video many years from now, at which point the current year will no longer be the current year. The phrase current year seems to have taken on the quality of a kind of inside joke, a wink and a nod which gestures to the mutual understanding that the present time is like an insubstantial liquid, almost as though the present is simply dissolving into the past rather than being carved into stone, almost as though we all unconsciously understand that current year is unmistakably liminal in a way that time is not really meant to be. Another common sardonic meme that you may have come across on social media is the half-sarcastic suggestion that perhaps the New Age Mayan calendar apocalypse prophecies actually turned out to be true after all, that the world really did, in some sense, end in the year 2012, and that we have effectively been living in an increasingly bizarre and rapidly dissolving facsimile of reality ever since. Now, of course, one could argue that the present is always, by definition, a kind of liminal space, and that's certainly true to some extent. It is necessarily that which lies between the past and future, a tiny island of concrete immanence which is situated between memories of the past, which are already being woven into myths, and a future which is fundamentally uncertain. There is undoubtedly some truth to such an observation, but I don't think it can fully explain the prevailing sense of liminality, which has seemingly been amplifying steadily for at least a decade now. There are numerous ways in which we could analyze this situation. We could talk about how the revolution in information technology, which began in the mid-20th century, has now begun to truly deliver on its promises through the ubiquity of social media, artificial intelligence, and the consequent atomization of human beings. We could talk about how the end of history was proclaimed with the end of the Cold War, but that instead we seem to find ourselves on the precipice of an entirely new historical epoch. There is undoubtedly truth in such perspectives, and there are surely numerous interpretations of the current year which might garner us genuine insights into where we are and how we got here. Ultimately, however, I think that the vast majority of these narratives fail to truly shed light on why we have found ourselves in such a strange situation. We can attempt to diagnose our current situation by pointing to certain factors which we can blame for leading us astray. Capitalism, social progressivism, social media technologies, liberal individualism, bureaucratization, but even though potentially true in part, these explanations don't ever seem truly adequate to me. None of them really seem to address the real questions. Where are we? How did we get here? Why did we come here? When are we? Before we move forward any further, I want to say that this is not going to be a doomer take on the nature and fate of Western civilization. Throughout the course of this narrative, there will be many things that probably seem very dark and which might seem to invite a very nihilistic attitude towards our past and our current situation. Ultimately, however, I do think that the story ends with a weapons-grade dose of hope. I'm going to be weaving a very meandering thread throughout this discussion, and so it might seem like I'm touching upon a wide range of distinct subjects that aren't directly related to one another. This is intentional, however, and as we approach the destination I have set us toward, I think it will become much more clear why all of these different narratives are all subplots in a much bigger story. The concept of repression was originally devised within the realm of depth psychology by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. I would go so far as to say that the notion of repression is in fact the central and foundational concept of both psychoanalysis and analytic psychology. The central thesis of all such depth psychology is that there are psychological contents which, for whatever reasons, come to be buried beneath the surface of ordinary waking consciousness. The very notion of an unconscious itself derives from this central insight into the nature of the human psyche, and it raises what is perhaps the most theoretically significant question within both psychoanalysis and analytic psychology. Why are some psychological contents available to the human ego, while other such contents remain beneath the waves of our minds? Freud came to understand repression, and thus the unconscious psyche, in terms of the friction between human sexuality and the constraints imposed upon the libido by civilized culture. According to Freud, the human psyche is fundamentally sexual, and this primal libido must therefore be restricted by the norms of civilization, which are signified by the psychological archetype of the father. This theoretical dynamic is the core of what psychoanalysts refer to as the Oedipus complex. Carl Jung, however, came to see the psyche as fundamentally driven by individuation rather than by sexuality. Jung interpreted the human libido not as the core of the psyche, but rather as an outgrowth of a more fundamental imperative which was much more mysterious and arcane in nature. The core of the psyche, according to Jung, was not libido, but rather what he referred to as the self, or soul. As Jung diverged from Freud in his understanding of the essence of the human psyche, so too did Jung come to diverge in his understanding of the unconscious. According to Jung, the unconscious was not simply a reservoir of repressed libidinal drives and thought patterns. Instead, Jung came to see the personal unconscious as being the aspect of the human psyche which bridged the boundary between the psyche of the individuals and what he called the collective unconscious. From a Jungian perspective, the question of the unconscious becomes flipped. Rather than asking, why are some psychical contents repressed so as to become unconscious, we might instead ask, why are some psychical contents conscious at all? In other words, if the majority of all psychical contents reside within the personal unconscious or collective unconscious, what is it that makes conscious psychical contents unique? Undoubtedly, this is an enormously complex question, but for now we can put forward some relatively simple answers. Waking consciousness tends to be characterized by a sense of direct executive agency. The thought contents which are available to our waking consciousness are contents which we are able to directly engage with and administer. To use a technological metaphor, a program that you need to actively manage needs to be open on your computer display, while something which is running automatically can be left to its own devices in the background. This way of conceptualizing the human psyche has numerous implications. It implies that there is no definitive boundary between the conscious and the unconscious. Unconscious contents may become conscious, and we might thereby come to exercise our agency over them, if we are able to bring such unconscious contents to the foreground of our awareness. It also implies that conscious contents might become unconscious as they become habitual, and therefore require less active administration from our psyches. The boundary between the conscious and unconscious psyche might also be conditioned by culture forms, thought forms, ritualistic practices, and may even change throughout the various stages of human psychological development over the course of one's lifetime. And yet, even within this extended framework for understanding the nature of the unconscious, there nevertheless remains the possibility that within the unconscious there might lie psychical contents which are dark, violent, narcissistic, and misanthropic. Carl Jung famously warned, quote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate," end quote. That which we cannot see within ourselves is that which we have no agency to control or direct, and there is no guarantee that the forces within us will not reveal themselves to be cancerous, devouring us or our world from within. Jung himself would eventually come to be immensely concerned with the forms of darkness which might lie within our depths, not only within the personal unconscious, but within the collective unconscious of Western civilization itself. Jean Gebser, a Swiss philosopher and linguist, would come to elaborate upon this depth psychological notion of the unconscious, most notably in his 2-volume magnum opus, The Ever-Present Origin. Within The Ever-Present Origin, Gebser details what he sees as the developmental trajectory of human consciousness throughout history. From our most primordial shimmerings of hominid awareness all the way to post-war hypermodernity. Gebser illustrates the history of the human psyche as a continually unfolding succession of consciousness structures. In total, Gebser outlines 5 such structures. These 5 structures are the archaic structure, the magical structure, the mythical structure, the mental structure, and the integral structure. Each structure understands reality and itself in terms which are specific to itself. The mythical structure, for example, understands the world in terms of the interplay of polar oppositions, yin and yang, day and night, fire and water, order and chaos. The mental structure, on the other hand, understands reality in terms of triadic relationships, 2 premises and a conclusion, the derivation of geometric values using trigonometry, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. As a new structure of consciousness emerges and eventually comes to prominence within human history, previously dominant structures come to be pushed outward, away from the focal point of waking awareness, and thus further into the realm which depth psychologists would refer to as the unconscious. Gebser tells us that we are now living through the gradual emergence of what he terms the integral consciousness structure. The modern world is one in which human consciousness remains partially enveloped by the heretofore dominant mental structure, while the integral structure struggles to emerge from it. This notion of integral consciousness is one which we will be returning to later on, but for now I want to focus upon the structures which lie beneath the surface of our ordinary awareness. Previously dominant structures of consciousness do not simply fossilize or fade away. All structures of consciousness which have thus far been developed continue to shape our awareness, our behavior, and our civilization. Yet these structures operate in ways that are often difficult to discern given our current situation, in which the mental structure has become deficient and thus unable to contend with the world without drastically distorting it. There's definitely much more to be said about the ever-present origin and Gebser's structures of consciousness than I will try to articulate here. But if this is something that you're interested in, then I do have several standalone videos about Gebser on this channel, which you might want to check out. For now, however, my purposes are more specific. The present is always a moment of unfolding. It is the future in liminal, nascent form. In order to understand the present, we must understand the future, which is struggling to be born through the present. To understand a future which still remains latent within the present, we must then understand the seeds of history and the nature of their ever-present germination. As such, I want us to now look to John Gebser's description of the first 2 structures of human consciousness, the archaic structure and the magical structure. In examining the transition between these first 2 structures, I think we will find some of the most primordial motifs of human history which have ultimately brought us to our present historical situation, and which continue to unfold within the present day. The archaic structure is the most fundamental and originary structure of consciousness. It is a mode of consciousness in which there is no real separation between the experiences of a given organism and the world that the organism inhabits. In ordinary thinking about our own consciousness, we tend to divide our reality into two distinct categories. There is the realm of our experiences, and then there is the world itself. There is, as such, a distinctive boundary between what is felt to be inside and what is felt to be outside of one's consciousness. Within the archaic structure, there is said to be no such distinction. One's consciousness is continuous with the world. One's experiences are part of the world, and the world is felt to be immanently present. This is pre-linguistic consciousness. It is the kind of awareness which is found in non-human animals, human infants, and the human ancestors which lived prior to the development of tools or language. It is the mode of consciousness which we can, at least to some degree, return to through certain kinds of holotropic meditative states, psychedelic experiences, or religious experiences. Archaic consciousness is the innermost depth of our awareness, that which is buried far beneath the waves and currents of modern, discursive thought forms and ego consciousness. Yet this felt sense of oneness with the world would eventually be disrupted by the emergence of tool usage and language. The archaic structure gave birth to the magical structure. Through language, our ancestors came to create a sense of tribal consciousness, which felt itself to be distinguished from nature. Our consciousness had yet to fission apart into isolated ego individuals in the way that it has in modernity. But there was now nevertheless a sense of a distinct world of thought and experience, which was shared by the human community, and which was distinct from the world itself. Although I cannot say with any certainty which came first, language seems to have co-originated with our capacity to cognize forms in themselves, apart from any particular entities or objects which might express such forms. A chimpanzee can look at a stick and see that the object expresses a form which can be used to fish for termites, but it cannot look at a branch and realize that the object could be carved into a spear. Our early hominid ancestors, however, were able to see forms independently. One could, for example, look at a flint rock and see not only what the object is, but what it could be if manipulated in the correct manner. Thus, our awareness of ourselves as something distinct from nature went hand in hand with our capacity to wield, manipulate, and transform nature, to draw from the powers of nature and use those powers to control our environments. Though the world was not yet divided into subject and object, or mind and matter, in the modernist sense, the magical structure nevertheless came to feel the world of human life as something distinct from the great mother from which it emerged. Just as we came to feel ourselves as different from the great mother, we simultaneously came to develop a kind of relational ambivalence towards her. Nature gave birth to us, and we depended upon her bounty and fecundity in order to survive. All of our powers, whether artificial or magical, were understood to draw from the vitalizing energies which emanated from the earth. Yet we also came to see that those same vitalizing powers were our greatest adversary, the greatest threat to the safety and perpetuation of human life. The will to harmonize ourselves with nature co-emerged with the will to dominate nature. Despite how much we might intuitively affiliate modern technology with science, reason, and the Enlightenment, there is nevertheless a deeply rooted connection between technology and the pre-rational, tribal consciousness of the magical structure. More often than not, we have no idea how our technological devices actually operate. We have no idea how technological infrastructure facilitates the functioning of modern societies. Despite our pretensions of rationalism, modern technology is nevertheless shrouded in an aura of magical thinking. Technology, generally speaking, is a human universal. Modern industrial and information technologies, however, originated specifically within the cultures of Western Europe. If we wish to understand our present historical situation, we undoubtedly must understand the nature of modern technologies. And to do that, we must understand the manner in which Western civilization is distinct from other human civilizations. In order to understand that distinction, we must understand the essence of modern technology and then come to understand how that essence relates to the essence of Western civilization itself. In his essay, The Question Concerning Technology, the German phenomenologist Martin Heidegger attempted to address the fundamental nature of modern technology. Heidegger tells us that the essence of modern technology is, paradoxically, not itself technological, implying that there is a deeper phenomenon at work within the history of Western metaphysics which has given rise to modern technology. Here we must understand that Heidegger sees history as a process within which the relationship between human life and nature has itself come to radically transform over the course of time. The history of humanity is, for Heidegger, the history of being, in which the human relationship to being has changed, and as such, the manner in which being comes to manifest in relation to us has also changed. Heidegger ultimately concludes that the essence of modern technology is a phenomenon which he refers to as inframing. Consider the difference between a wooden bridge and a hydroelectric dam, and the way these two kinds of technology alter our relationship to the world and our understanding of the world. A bridge is, of course, a form of technology. It allows us to cross the river and thus facilitates the human life processes which also created the bridge. The bridge is but one of innumerable ways in which human technologies bring human life to be interwoven with the natural world. With the hydroelectric dam, however, something very different comes to occur metaphysically and phenomenologically. The hydroelectric dam is distinct from the bridge in that it renders the river in a very different way. The hydroelectric dam serves as a kind of lens, in a sense, through which the river appears to us as something which the simple wooden bridge could not show us. Through this lens, the river is revealed to be a body of standing reserve, a source of potential resources and power to be extracted from in a mechanized way. The hydroelectric dam reveals the world in a way that all modern technology does. It casts the world in such a light that we come to regard it as a body of resources to be extracted, manipulated, and wielded. The ecological interdependency of these things is erased, and things within the world, such as rivers, forests, or even human beings, thus come to be unworlded, stripped away from their place within the vast webs of natural relationships and regarded merely as reserve, or rather, capital. Modern technology, therefore, is a manifestation of how relationships of power have come to condition the way in which Western thought has come to understand the world in general. It is, within the realm of human life activity, the correlative of a parallel process which has also been occurring within the realm of Western thought. For Heidegger, the entire history of Western philosophy has been a history of conflict between the human psyche and being itself. This is a history which Heidegger sees as having arrived at its ultimate consummation within the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche. Unlike many of the innumerable commentators who have critiqued and analyzed Nietzsche, Heidegger attempts to understand Nietzsche by digging to the core of Nietzsche's thought, by understanding the underlying metaphysics which Nietzsche gave expression to. The beating heart at the core of Nietzsche's work is the will to power. For Nietzsche, all reality itself is an expression of will to power. For Heidegger, Nietzsche represents the fulfillment of Western history, in that all of Western history has been directed towards the realization of will to power, the will to mastery over the world, the will to dominate nature. Yet we must also understand that the very notion of will to power is itself a concept which presupposes a very Western understanding of human subjectivity, one in which the human ego forms a sort of atomic nucleus, which the world is brought into relationship with. If the history of Western metaphysics is, as Heidegger indicates, a history of the realization of a metaphysics of will to power, then this implies that the history of Western metaphysics is even more fundamentally a history of the human individual, a history of a uniquely Western understanding of the human subject as ego-subjectivity. Heidegger demonstrates this by the manner in which he shows that Nietzsche's metaphysics was prefigured and conditioned by the metaphysics of René Descartes, the father of all modern philosophy. Descartes' philosophy begins with an absolute skepticism. He resolves to doubt everything that can possibly be doubted, including his own thoughts and the reality of the world itself. Descartes attempts to back up, as it were, as far as he can go until there is nothing left that he can possibly doubt, in an effort to find some solid foundation which philosophical thought can anchor itself upon. The foundation which Descartes ultimately finds is the infamous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. At first brush, this might seem like an almost comically obvious statement. It seems to be simply a vacuous affirmation that Descartes himself does indeed exist. However, if we look more closely at what is happening here within this inner dialogue, I think we find something much more profound at work here. Descartes doubts everything that can be doubted until there is nothing left to doubt. When there is nothing left to doubt, what could possibly remain but the source of doubt itself? The I, which is referred to in the statement, I think, therefore I am, is not the whole of Descartes' being, his soul or self. It does not include his past, his relationship to other human beings, or the world around him. The I, which remains when all else is stripped away, is ultimately nothing but an organ of doubt, of scrutiny, skepticism, inquiry, and perhaps even fear and paranoia. Although it seems like the I think, therefore I am is merely a tautological statement made to serve a rather innocuous, though perhaps misguided epistemological purpose, there is much more at work here. That which Descartes is affirming as I is being crowned as the most central, fundamental, and executive aspect of Descartes' own psyche. It is the aspect of the human psyche which is most fundamentally concerned with scrutinizing the world, doubting, and thus the aspect of the human psyche which is most concerned with achieving certainty. This certainty is then achieved through quantification. Descartes, though he is often considered to be the father of modern rationalism, was far from an atheistic materialist himself. Descartes was deeply religious, and moreover, Descartes saw immense significance in his own dreams. In one series of dreams, Descartes recounts that he encountered an angel who told him that, quote, the conquest of nature would be achieved through number and measure, end quote. From our modern perspective, this statement might not seem to be a particularly interesting revelation, but understood in context, we can see that this idea was immensely revolutionary in potential. Within classical philosophy, mathematics was commonly understood to be the highest form of human inquiry. It was through mathematics that the human mind was most able to transcend the world of appearances, and thus bring itself into contact with the world of pure forms. The notion that nature, the realm of God's creation, could be conquered by human beings, let alone conquered through the use of mathematical forms, was anything but obvious prior to the development of Descartes' philosophy. Here we can see the intimate connection between the Cartesian ego, the technological enframing of modern science, and the metaphysics of will to power, which would find expression within the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche. The I, which Descartes identifies within the cogito ergo sum, is a locus of what Heidegger terms self-securing power. It is a sense of ego-individualism which is secure only in its own self-assuredness, and which therefore regards the whole of the external world as suspect, and as definitively outside the bounds of one's ego-subjectivity. Descartes' philosophy, in other words, contracted the human sense of self inwards into a kind of metaphysical and epistemological prison of executive control. Everything outside of that ego-subjective control tower became regarded as external, as object in contrast with the subjectivity of the Cartesian ego. This separation of subjectivity and objectivity then formed the basis of Descartes' mind-matter bifurcation, in which the external world of nature came to be seen as a standing reserve of inert, vacuous, dead matter, which could be freely extracted from, manipulated, and technologized by the human ego. Descartes came to see plant and animal life, as well as the human body, as being merely mechanistic matter, devoid of animacy except insofar as an immaterial soul was able to intervene and control material bodies, much like a pilot flying a plane. Descartes believed that plant and animal life lacked such immaterial souls, and thus believed that such creatures were merely automata, biological machines which behaved in an entirely mechanistic manner without any sense of internal subjectivity or conscious awareness. The Cartesian ego is not simply a term which refers to consciousness itself, but rather one which equivocates human subjectivity with a central nexus of power. Nietzsche's metaphysics of will to power is thus entirely dependent upon this Cartesian understanding of the human subject. The very notion of the will to power, as Nietzsche understands it, is only comprehensible in terms of an individual ego which is entirely delineated from the external world, such that relationships of power can be defined through referring back to the central locus of ego subjectivity. If, on the other hand, we understand the I in a different manner, this understanding of life in terms of will to power begins to fall apart. If, for example, we understand the I as equivalent to the Hindu Atman, then we find a very different understanding of human existence. The Atman, understood as the most fundamental essence of human beings, is identical with Brahman, the universal consciousness which animates all of reality. Thus, human consciousness, as with all consciousness, is drawn towards a spiritual reunion with Brahman, and thus an ultimate self-realization of the identity between self and world. Throughout most human cultures and most spiritual traditions throughout the world, we find something similar to this, an understanding of human existence in which there is a continuity between human consciousness and the consciousness of God or nature or both. The Cartesian understanding of human consciousness not only sets the foundations upon which the thought of Nietzsche and other thinkers would later be built, it also set the conditions for the entire modernist worldview and the relationship between human beings and nature which would arise from that worldview. Scientism, machine technology, liberal individualism, and capitalism would all come to emerge from the Cartesian metaphysics of human ego subjectivity. The entirety of modern Western history is a history of the Cartesian ego. The Nietzschean and thus Cartesian understanding of the human essence is therefore a very specific consequence of the development of Western civilization. Yet the development of the Cartesian ego was not an isolated event in the history of metaphysics. Rather, this development must be understood as an unfolding of an inner logic which, as we will come to see, has animated the whole of Western history. In 1918, the German polymath Oswald Spengler published the first volume of his monumental work, which has been titled in English, The Decline of the West. This title is somewhat misleading when contrasted with the original German title, however, in a way which we will come to see is immensely significant. The term translated as decline in English translations is the German Untergang, which I am almost certainly not pronouncing correctly, but which can be better understood as indicating not only a decline, but moreover a descent, or even more aptly, a setting, such as the setting of the sun through the western horizon. Within the decline of the West, Spengler sought to understand history in a manner that was greatly at odds with almost any other approaches advanced within academia. Rather than understanding history in terms of political epochs or a dialectic of material relations, Spengler instead saw history as being constituted by the life cycles of civilizations. Civilizations which, he contended, were structured in the same essential manner as biological organisms. The history of a civilization is the history of a certain form language, a complex interwoven tapestry of symbols, images, myths, and practices which served as the lifeblood of a given civilization. Each civilization is characterized by a distinct form language, and within the core of each form language is a most fundamental symbol and most fundamental myth, an symbol and myth. All aspects of a civilization's form language are meaningful insofar as they refer back to the foundational symbol and myth, which serve as the beating hearts of human culture forms. Spengler's work was dedicated to understanding the morphology and life cycles of civilizations, and he develops a colorful taxonomy of the civilizations which have given shape to world history. Yet, as previously indicated, I think that the very title of Spengler's magnum opus indicates that there is something deeper at play, even than civilizational morphology, within the trajectory of Western history. Something which has conditioned the evolution of civilizational form languages within the Western world as a whole. Beneath the particular form languages, political structures, institutions, religious creeds, and even symbols is, I believe, something even more primordial that has conditioned the destiny of the Western spirit, the archetypal image of the sun's journey from east to west. In order to understand what I mean by this, it is important to understand that every single human civilization ultimately traces its origins back into the mythical and still earlier magical structures of consciousness. Modes of consciousness in which nothing is merely a blunt physical fact resultant from contingent physical interactions, but rather in which the structure of material reality itself is ultimately a spiritual structure. Everything is, as we might say, meaningful coincidence or synchronicity, as it is understood by the magical structure of human consciousness. All things were felt and understood to be manifestations of a spiritual reality which was structured in terms of signification, motif, recurrence, and aesthetic form. As such, the morphology of human consciousness and human civilization has always been conditioned by the most basic symbolic structures of our reality. The underworld is always understood to be underground and to be the realm of the dead, in accordance with the fact that dead things fall to the ground and decompose. They are swallowed up by the earth, as it were. The transcendental realm is always associated with the sky as a realm of eternal forms, and typically considered to be the domain of the gods that have a more benevolent relationship to humanity. Yet perhaps the most prominent aspect of our world, other than maybe the presence of the earth beneath our feet, is the presence and regular behaviors of the sun. We must also understand here that regardless as to what we think about astrology in the modern world, whether you believe it is simply pseudoscience or tabloid nonsense or whatever the case may be, it is undeniably true that human beings until very recently in history saw the world and thought about the world in ways that were thoroughly astrological in character. Virtually all human thought regarding religion, mythology, metaphysics, alchemy, and even politics were inextricably interwoven with the symbolism of astrology. As such, I believe it is the case that astrological significations are still at work in shaping the morphology of both the personal and collective unconscious of human beings. More specifically, what I am suggesting here is that the symbolic motif of the sun's westward trajectory across the sky is in fact the most primordial and fundamental archetype which has shaped the entire history of Western civilization for at least the last 8,000 years, and in all likelihood, vastly longer. In order to understand the archetypal significance of the sun, we must understand the manner in which mythical consciousness understood the human soul. In modern parlance, the soul is regarded as a singular entity, but within mythical and later Platonic metaphysics, the soul was regarded as consisting of multiple structures which interweave with one another within human beings. Different religious and esoteric traditions have analyzed the spiritual structure of the human person in somewhat different ways, often dividing the soul into two or more distinct soul aspects. Here, however, I want to focus on a central dichotomy, which we see iterated consistently throughout numerous religious and mystical traditions, and which forms the core of the narrative I am attempting to articulate here. Here I will be referring to this as the distinction between soul and spirit. From the perspective of modern rationalism, both soul and spirit might seem to be antiquated ideas which are no longer useful in understanding the actual world or the actual nature of human beings. Attempting to define exactly what soul or spirit mean would seem to be a wild goose chase, but upon further examination, I believe we find that the ideas expressed by these terms are actually quite consistent and precise, even if this is a consistency and precision which differs dramatically from the sort we have come to expect from rationalistic science and philosophy. Although elaborating more fully on this distinction between soul and spirit could easily be an entire video in itself, for now I think we can most easily understand this distinction as being one between the personal and the interpersonal, as well as a distinction between the future and the past. The soul is associated with the sun and refers primarily to the continuity of one's personal identity. The soul is the solar principle within us. It is the center of gravity which weaves the human being together into a singular personality. Moreover, the soul is the source of will, the underlying force which compels all our drives, striving, longing, desires, and ambitions, is ultimately a sort of primordial will to life. That primordial will is the soul. It is that which directs us into the future. It is that which distinguishes us from other persons. And it is that which gravitationally binds all of the distinct aspects of our being into a living unity. The soul is associated with the elements of air and fire, and considered to be that which transcends the boundaries of life and death. The spirit, conversely, is associated with the moon, whereas the soul is a primal will which distinguishes us from others. The spirit consists of forces which weave human beings together and connects us with the past, our ancestors, and the living forces of the earth and nature. Spirit is associated with water and with blood, which is seen as that which interconnects human beings together in structures of families, kinship groups, tribes, and nations. All water returns ultimately to the ocean, within which the identity of individual droplets of water is lost into the continuous oneness of the sea. Likewise, one's spirit consists of archetypal forces which flow through us and animate our minds and bodies, but which are ultimately transpersonal. If the soul is like a star radiating outward from a singular point, then spirit is oceanic, consisting of continuous flows and cycles which invigorate the natural world. In many ways, human existence is a sort of balancing act between soul and spirit, between the solar and lunar principles which animate us. In different cultures and religious traditions, we find different ways of negotiating the roles and priorities of these polar aspects. We can see a practice like ancestor worship, for example, as emphasizing the priority of spirit. As such practices pay reverence to lineages of heredity, which are relationships of blood and thus spiritual or lunar power. We can also see this dialectic interplay within myths. Within the Odyssey, for example, we have a heroic individual endeavoring in a tumultuous journey across the sea. Throughout this quest, the sea consistently looms as an impersonal, wine-dark power of madness and primal vitality, which threatens to subsume and devour the hero Odysseus. The soul is ever in danger of being consumed by the spiritual forces which it navigates. The soul must either master the sea which it resides within, as in the case of Odysseus, or become like a fish which can swim in accordance with those currents, a metaphor which we find in later Christian symbology. While the solar is often associated with the masculine and the lunar with the feminine, these associations are not absolute, and we can certainly speak of feminine manifestations of the solar and masculine manifestations of the lunar. The cycles of the moon itself correlate with human menstrual cycles, thus connecting the lunar with the feminine, as well as the blood relations of ancestry and kinship. The solar will is often regarded as masculine, as the will as seen as active rather than passive. The sun shines forth of its own light, while the moon reflects this light into the darkness of the night. While the solar will is directed forward towards future possibilities, the lunar spirit consists in the inheritances of the past. Solar thinking contemplates the world in abstract terms, considering mathematical objects or forms in themselves. Lunar thinking, conversely, is reflective. It dwells and ruminates upon what one has experienced and synthesizes such experiences into a cohesive and meaningful narrative. Having introduced this polarity of soul and spirit, our next task will be to look at one of the most significant transformations of human consciousness within human history as a whole, what the philosopher Karl Jaspers refers to as the Axial Age, a period which began during what we often refer to as the Bronze Age, in which the relationship between soul and spirit would come to be radically re-territorialized in a manner that would lay the groundwork for all of subsequent human history, and the history of Western civilization in particular. In the next episode of this series, we will begin by looking at what exactly the Axial Age amounted to, and then begin to determine how the transformations of that age came to shape the destiny which ultimately brought us to the liminal space where we now find ourselves.